I'm going to do a brief introduction as we get started here and people join us. I'm Melanie Wendell, the Executive Director of the Sustainable Entertainment Society, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the last workshop of SPF24, the Climate Writing Toolkit, Touchstones, Strategies, and Mitigation, facilitated by Jordan Hall, and our program partner is the Independent Production Fund.
Thank you so much, Mel. And I want to say thank you so much to you and your team for holding this space and for all of our attendees to be here. So I'm going to start off. Oh, we may already have our moment of technical difficulty. Let's see if this will click. Excellent. An integral part of climate writing is our relationship to the land. And so here in Vancouver, where I am, it's essential to acknowledge that we live on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Stolo nations, and that our ecological movements have benefited immensely from their leadership and knowledge. And if you're ever interested in which territories you may be on, we've got the link for native land below. So our plan for the day. Basically, I'm going to talk for a little bit about narrative concepts and some potential case studies. That's going to take us to about 9:30. From about 9:30 to 9:45, you're going to be doing group work with those scripts that you were assigned, ideally in sort of little pockets where everyone has read the same script. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about the discoveries that you've made in terms of applying the narrative work to those scripts. We'll take a little break. We'll come back and talk more about sort of the practical concerns in terms of approaching mitigation for scripts. And then we'll again have another little round of group work, looking at your script from a slightly different lens, and then come back, share that, and wrap ourselves up. That's the plan for the day. Before we get too far into me talking, I would absolutely love for folks to put their names into the meeting chat, names, pronouns, and if you did the homework or just have brought with you climate concerns, storytelling that you'd like to be doing, I'd love to hear a little bit about that in the chat, just to get a sense of who's here. All right. Keep putting those up, folks, because that's going to be great for me to take a look at as we go. So here we go, climate storytelling. So I think one of the things we end up hearing a lot when we come into the idea of climate storytelling is that people seem to find it difficult. And I like to frequently start these talks with this question of why do we feel like climate storytelling is so difficult? And there are a few reasons that this comes up. One of the biggest problems that we encounter when we tell stories about climate is the problem of scale. We're often trying to engage with storytelling that's happening at scales far beyond the human. So the scale of it is huge in terms of, say, the physical scale of droughts and forest fires, the chronological scale when we think about even just the space of a sort of human-caused climate change. We're thinking about a time scale that spans generations from the Industrial Revolution, and the intellectual complexity, the interconnectedness of ecosystems and biodiversity and the way they interact. It can all be really frustrating to try to get into with our minds. And then as we try to engage with it, it's something that's happening to us. And so we frequently also experience a kind of emotional toll trying to tell stories about climate change, right? We may be experiencing grief for things we perceive ourselves as having lost. We may be experiencing frustration in terms of having known about this since, the late 1960s, and feeling like there's been a paucity of action, right? The disappointment of that. People may experience empathy fatigue, which is essentially there's only so far that we can extend empathy before we begin to be unable to sustain that ourselves. We exhaust ourselves. A lot of us, I'm sure, are very frustrated with the way the political discourse plays out. And all of that can lead to feeling like it's hard to find an avenue into the narrative for ourselves. And finally, we also sometimes find ourselves just facing the problem of screenplay structure, because screenplay structure has developed to follow sort of an individual protagonist across a journey that's going to take 20 to 220 minutes, depending upon, what genre you're in, or what form you're in. And we're going to follow that individual protagonist as they come to a realization, take action, and the world simply changes because of that. And that in and of itself isn't perhaps a narrative form that feels really suited to addressing climate change, where we have to think about sustained collective action, where we have to think about complex ecosystem where no one actor is going to save the world. So as we come into this, there's a few tendencies that begin to crop up. The first thing is these narrative challenges mean we experience a kind of uneasiness about how we're going to tell stories about climate change. It puts us in a place of immediate discomfort. This is something that Naomi Klein actually describes really well in The Shock Doctrine. She talks about the idea that humans are narrative animals. And we process the world through narrative, which means that when we encounter something that we don't understand how to tell stories about, we move into a sort of a space of confusion and become vulnerable. And in the Shock Doctrine, she's talking a lot about the fact that in spaces after, say, natural disasters, people are in this space of being unable to narrativize, being unable to make a story out of their experience. And they are then vulnerable to other narratives that are proposed, right? And that what she calls disaster capitalists will at that point say, move in and offer to buy your destroyed home. And too bad you've just lost land that your family, maybe worked years to own. You can also think of this in terms of the context of the kind of stories we tell over and over again. Since the Industrial Revolution, and this is sort of an idea that gets forwarded by Amitabh Ghosh, who has a great book called The Great Derangement, we've been in a kind of storytelling of rationalism and industrialism and capitalism, and that kind of storytelling forwards a sense of sort of individual agency, individual achievement, and endless potential growth. And that kind of storytelling, again, makes it really hard for us to just conceptualize what the stories of climate change are. So one of the first things we find ourselves doing as we try to create narratives about climate change is we tend to run to narratives that we understand how to tell. So if you've ever thought, oh, we tell a lot of stories about dystopias, and we tell a lot of stories about sort of post-apocalyptic worlds, well, science fiction has taught us how to tell those stories. And so our little narrative brains run over there to the thing that we know. And I will never put a huge bunch of shade on sci-fi and dystopias. I love them. But we have a lot of them. And the trick is that they are easier narratives in the sense that they don't require us to act in the moment. They kind of presuppose that we've lost this fight, and they bury the cost of sort of human suffering and inequality in the backstory that we don't see a lot of the time. So the question becomes, how do we start to reach for these sort of next stories about climate change? And the good and the bad news is we are figuring that out. As Mel really eloquently said, we're in the space of both experiencing and trying to figure out how to narrativize this. So there's no real wrong answer. We're in the process of experimentation. And I think if we get used to that idea, the idea that we're going to try, we're going to experiment, we're going to fail, we open up a lot of spaces for narrative exploration for storytelling, and that in itself, I think, is exciting. And I think also comforting just to be like, hey, if you're feeling like this is hard and you're uncomfortable, you're not alone. We can all get used to that in our process. So thinking about what we want in our climate stories, like our next climate stories, a few tendencies that I can see emerging are we want accuracy, both in terms of the scientific and in terms of the experiential. I think the drive for accuracy comes out of a sense that we've been in a space for a long time where we've had to deal with climate facts, feeling like they are being distorted or misrepresented, and we want to feel like the story is being told with attention to that kind of detail. But I think even more importantly, I think we all are looking for climate change stories that we recognize, right? That feel like the experience that we are having as we all live through the climate crisis. And that comes again, right from Aristotle, right from the idea that we want our art to reflect our lives. And I think if we're feeling a growing hunger for accurate stories about the climate, it is that sense that I think it was the Good Energy Playbook had done a study that showed that about 2% of scripts were actually acknowledging that climate change was happening. I'm hoping the numbers have increased since that study, and I want to say 2022. But that, like, not having our art reflect our lives is creating a gap there. Uh, and this, I think, then speaks to the next thing that we're hoping for in our climate storytelling, which is, I think we're hoping also to see something that can address that empty narrative space that Naomi Klein is talking about when she talks about our not knowing how to tell stories about this. We want to figure out how to tell stories that are going to talk to our grief and talk to our anger and talk to our frustration. And we also want to see paths forward. We want to see things that are going to show us how it is we find our way to hope. Like we're hoping to build these new narrative models. And I think a final big part of that is going to be, how do we start forwarding real discussions in terms of climate change? Because a huge part of climate discourse for the last at least 20 years has been taken up by a kind of really distorted discussion where, like, the issue is split kind of into two sides, and one of those sides is, by and large, having to kind of ignore facts and distort the truth to put forward a kind of narrative. And that means that we spend a lot of time in the headspace of this sort of false, or at least disingenuous conversation. It's eating up our headspace for thinking about it, and it's eating up our headspace for making art. And so I think a big part of what we're looking for here is also this question of, like, how do we move towards, like, the real vital conversations that we all know we have about this, rather than giving space to that conversation that's not helping us. So, oh, I keep hitting my space bar, I'm sorry. Thinking about accuracy. This is sort of the first place we can start. And obviously, when we think about accuracy, the first place to begin is with research, and speaking to scientists can always be really, really illuminating in terms of what we can discover. And frequently, actually, I find really hopeful. Like, you'll find people who are working on things that aren't even the sort of the common narrative that we hold for ourselves about where the climate is. But it can also be really intimidating. There can be a lot of information, there can be a lot of nuances to try to process. And so one of the things I tend to think about, especially in the fiction space rather than the documentary space, is how much of our job is about filtering that information. How much of that job is about us taking facts and turning them into narratives. And so that what our responsibility is not necessarily our responsibility to the exact, the millimeter of sea level rise, but to the accuracy of the story, where this is the story of the person whose home is going to be lost, how they're going to survive their displacement. So one big strategy to come into accuracy is to think about, yes, absolutely, our accountability to the facts, but also our accountability to the personal, to the lived experience, to the way those facts actually move into our lives. Like, that's the storytelling element. And another part of this that I think can be really, like, again, exciting in terms of where you can start to approach narratives is thinking about the ideas of narratives that you might want to, like, move away from, or complicate, or challenge, or just change entirely. Like, I spend a lot of time when I start into projects thinking about, I have no interest anymore in giving headspace to the sort of the false argument of denialism. So then the question becomes, what's behind the denialism? Why might we still be vulnerable to it? What's our psychology? Recently at SPF, we had the real joy of getting to talk to Dr. Charisse Dupreez, and one of the narratives that she's really interested in changing is the idea that the deep ocean is sort of a barren wasteland full of monsters, right? Like, I think we think of it, it's dark, it's barren, it's full of anglerfish and things like that. But the reality is her narrative of it is that it is teeming with life and exciting, beautiful creatures. And this is actually a really important narrative to think about changing, because much in the same way that, like, the first colonial settlers who came to North America described it as a vast and untamed wilderness, and elided the people they were about to displace and steal the land from with that narrative, right? Saying that the deep ocean is a barren wasteland where nothing will be hurt if they start deep core mining is a narrative that serves an interest that can be really dangerous to the climate. So thinking about how we change that narrative, doing work that can change that narrative is really, really valuable. And another idea is simply like challenging the narratives that are being put forward by actors who maybe with the best of intentions, or maybe not with the best of intentions, are presenting themselves as part of the solution when they're not. For instance, we have an initiative right now in Canada where we're going to plant 2 billion trees, which sounds terrific on the face of it. But if we put those trees into peat bogs, where some of those trees are headed, we're actually going to be releasing more carbon than we're going to gain from planting the trees. So what is that narrative of like greening ourselves, but not greening ourselves? There's a lot of options for storytelling there. And in terms of case study for how to do this really well, we can think about something like Chernobyl, where we have this really high degree of scientific accuracy. Like, again, it's not 100% perfect. That's not the purpose of this, but we've spent time thinking about what was this event, what happened, how do we reflect the history as accurately as possible. But that all of that accuracy is being used to support the human drama of these scientists, and in particular, these scientists grappling with a premise that is essential to climate change, in the sense of not denial as the denialism that's problematic in the headspace, but if we don't look at this, if we don't act, right, what will the consequences be? And all of that comes together really well when we examine how Chernobyl is working as a case study where accuracy is being leveraged for climate narrative. So before I head into our second storytelling piece, another narrative that I think we have to think about our relationship to is this narrative of capitalism, because one of the most persistent problems we have in envisioning climate storytelling and making climate interventions at all is that it's hard to envision what our lives would look like outside of the space of capitalism. Capitalism is a really persuasive narrative. Like Walter Benjamin described it almost as a religion, like you are born into it, and it shapes your understanding of the world, like what our lives should look like, what success looks like, what should we be striving for, what comfort looks like. All of it is sort of baked into what capitalism is. And on top of this, capitalism is very hard to sort of work around because it's great at absorbing other stories, right? Like if anybody here went to the Barbie movie and felt like really amazed at the sophisticated critiques it was leveling at corporate America while simultaneously like being a $1 billion event that was selling a doll, like that's an impressive narrative in terms of its ability to just metabolize other stories. And the famous quote really is Frederick Jameson's, that it is easier for us to envision the end of the world than for us to imagine the end of capitalism. So this is an important story for us to think about how are we narrativizing our existence in that way. And so there's a lot of strategies we can take up to address capitalism as a narrative. As much as it can like feel like a black hole with an inescapable event horizon, that's like the story isn't as monolithic as that. There's been considerable pushback for at least the last 100 years. Like you can look at successes from labor unions, FDR's New Deal, right? Like in the middle of the New Deal, people who were on the dole because of the Great Depression were being employed to create public parks, right? Like there are absolutely regenerative ideas happening there. Clean air and water protections were pushed through in the 1970s by Richard Nixon of all people, which is hilarious. The gains weren't equally shared. There are absolutely problematic things about them, but that kind of change is possible. We just need the imagination to be doing it and to be thinking about what those models look like. And hey, if you are not ready to abandon capitalism entirely, I don't expect everyone to come with me. You may be able to think about moving from an unregulated extractive capitalism towards, well, what is a socially responsible, what is a community regulated capitalism that is intended to like grow small businesses, make sure that people have homes? What does that shift or transition look like? And there's lots of alternative models that exist. I'm going to, in a little bit, talk about Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140. But at the heart of that novel is a housing cooperative that's emerged in a flooded New York. You have nonprofit university models in Germany and Scandinavia, which are giving young people the opportunity to like decide what to do with their lives without crushing debt to force them into certain models of work. I am speaking to you right now, in fact, from a housing co-op, which is how I can exist in Vancouver as the tiny little Marxist that I am. And so there's all kinds of models for resilience and community that exist if we just think about how we put them forward. And I think it's always good to like acknowledge there are a lot of pleasures to capitalism, right? There are lots of things that we enjoy in terms of the convenience of our lives, but it's also worth thinking about what we pay for them because we're paying for them in a livable environment. So, in fact, there we are. This brings us to our case study here, which is New York 2140 is an amazing novel that I will invite you all to read. And generally, Kim Stanley Robinson is a writer who's doing excellent work in the climate space. And one of the things that's exciting about this is that if you read it, it's sort of a beautiful story about a community solving a mystery about like who's trying to essentially take the land of Manhattan back from these sort of housing co-ops and collective movements that have emerged in the wake of a great flood. But what's really alive about it is that it envisions both climate change and capitalism as ongoing lived experiences, right? That rather than thinking about this as something in a before and after, the idyllic pre and the dystopian post, no, this is something that's going on right now, and this is a living contest. It is the living contest we are in fact, because it's focusing around the people in the housing collective. You have this beautiful cast of characters. So again, you have the personal and the connection there. And it's a terrific model for how it is we take these ideas, these sort of big intellectual ideas that I'm talking about in terms of like the address to capitalism, and we think about ways in which they become hopeful, ways in which they become community based, and also ways in which they are aware and intersectional of the inequalities that occur within the space of the climate crisis. Oh, that was my last sort of like good news about addressing capitalism. The good news about addressing capitalism is that addressing capitalism is inherently a part of decolonizing, which we are all in the process of learning how to do, and a big part of it is thinking about how we change our relationships to each other in that way. So as we move into the idea now, this sort of third piece of having real conversations about the climate, we can start also thinking about how we can apply a climate lens to our work, because this is the space of having those real conversations. And so three big places we can start thinking about how a climate lens moves into our writing is clearly we can think about the premise of the show, right? Like we have absolutely shows like Extrapolations that are just taking up climate right away. We have shows like Snowpiercer, which is admittedly in the more dystopian vein, but there it is. It's still moving there. But you could also think about, could you pitch, say, a climate episode for a particular show? Grey's Anatomy had an episode a couple years ago where the heat dome was going to force everyone to operate in a blackout. Let me find my note there. You can also think about, if the show itself doesn't want to have climate as its immediate premise, is there a way to take a familiar model and turn that into a show that acknowledges climate in some way? There was an old Kerry Russell and Will Arnett comedy called Running Wild that was absolutely about the relationship between sort of someone who was more in the space of business and climate denial versus this sort of the love of his life who was an activist, and we found our way into sort of the fish out of water, the oddball comedy through the lens of climate change there. We can also think about ways in which, if that's again not where our show wants to be, not the thing our show wants to talk about, just finding climate as a backdrop in the way that climate is the backdrop to almost all of our existences right now, right? If you're creating a show that is about life in a small town, life in small towns is changing as climate affects them, right? So are you finding moments where, for instance, an animal or a berry or a season has moved or changed, is not dependable anymore in the backdrop of your small town comedy? And you can also definitely think about characters as a space for a climate lens, because characters, again, are a great space for different discourses to move into scripts. Like I find myself thinking about, like for instance, Dallas Goldtooth in Reservation Dogs, right? Is just a natural space for Indigenous ideas about land and what land management means to find its way into that text. Uh, I find in general it's a good idea as you're doing this to just think about pretty much everyone I know, and I suspect pretty much everyone you know, has opinions and feelings about climate change. And the more you just bake that into character creation, the more you'll find it's just emerging organically as the characters move through their lives. Oh, yeah, I think I just actually went through those. That was my other one. How to Blow Up a Pipeline was a lovely movie not too long ago that was looking a lot at like a cross section of like American citizens and thinking about what are the reasons they might engage in destroying a pipeline, and the various different things that bring them to that space. And I think, yes, familiar premise with the climate pitch. Oh, and yes, the idea of turning climate into a runner. In another talk, Deborah Fortenberry, who worked on extrapolations, talked about the idea of how can we use climate to solve our story problems? Like if we don't want two people to be able to chat with each other, can we cause a rolling blackout because of a climate event? Absolutely. And so talked about character. Sorry, I got ahead of my slides. But if we think about case studies, for instance, climate as context is a big part of years and years, right? We're following in this the dynamics of a family over many, many decades. But climate change is just baked into the background as we move through time, and the entire piece feels more real because of that backdrop. There's a moment when the family's going to lose touch with various members, and that happens in the context of floods moving into London. So it's just climate is just there in the backdrop as the reality of the piece. And then in terms of character, we could look at, say, Ted Lasso and Sam in Ted Lasso, who, as an optimist, has an episode where he's discovering that the people they have signed on with to be their sponsors are implicated in mining in his home country in Nigeria. And what's lovely about this is, again, because he is such an optimistic character, we have our climate change emerging from this sort of organic, activist, and really joyful and collective because of what Sammy is as a character and what Ted Lasso is as a show space. And Mel, I see you're up there. Are you waving at me for time? Okay, thank you so much. All right. I'm gonna just really quickly talk through three little strategy things, and then we're gonna put ourselves into our workshop rooms. So a few strategies that can come out of these sort of narrative movements that we encounter. It's always a good idea to consider comedy. It can be hard to deal with climate change, but pretty much everybody I know engages in coping humor. We have fun with the absurdity of things. And in particular, Ursula K. Heiss, who has a great book called Imagining Extinction, talks about comedy as a genre that is about finding equilibrium again, right? Where someone who has perhaps had misanthropic tendencies finds a way to come into balance with society again. And in many ways, that's the human story right now. We have to find a way to sort of moderate our own tendencies and come back into equilibrium with, the biosphere that is sustaining us. Myths can also be really useful because myths speak to these sort of longer cycles. If you're reading The Great Derangement, you'll find there are spaces where myth is absolutely holding space for the climate in terms of like how far tsunami markers are up in the sort of the Japanese hills, right? We knew these things and then we let them go as we moved into the industrial mode. And hybridity, so like unexpected partnerships, like if you think about things like Kevin the Seal making his way into Deadlock, and how Kevin the Seal moves this is not Kevin the Seal in Deadlock, but definitely watch Deadlock. The way he moves the plot forward as an agent of chaos is a wonderful integration of climate into storytelling. We always want to think about intersectionality because the climate crisis affects people differently depending upon their levels of privilege. And Indigenous communities may have solutions that we're not thinking about. So thinking about consultation. I was at a workshop not too long ago where we were talking about how to deal with like heating in the sea level. And the Indigenous representation there was just like, no one asked us. We know how to build water gardens. We know how to like encourage salt marsh, and this helps mitigate. So thinking about where you can build relationships, where you can have those conversations. What are our intersections with the climate, with the more than human in terms of the intersectional? That's the wrong direction. Let's go this way. And finally, I'll come back to other forms when we do our wrap up, but there's lots of other forms that we can look at for guidance in terms of how we tell these stories. So we're going to come in now to talking about the climate past, which as opposed to talking about narrative concerns is thinking about what can we do to mitigate the carbon costs of our scripts. And so the first part of this for me is always thinking about where are the carbon costs of production, right? Like where are we when we write things incurring carbon costs? And so, for instance, we have the Sustainable Production Alliance gave us these figures last year, actually. The idea that on average, if you're writing a film with like a $70 million budget, you're creating about 3,000 and change in carbon emissions. So that's like driving a car for 500 years. And then indie films will come in a little bit lower at about 400 metric tons. Episodes of 1 hour scripted are usually coming in at about 80 tons, and half-hour scripted and unscripted are just a little over 20 metric tons. In terms of telefilm's most recent numbers, Canada, like as a country, telefilm is estimating, as of I think February of 2024, that we're putting out about 7,000 tons for features and about 260,000 tons for TV. And like, again, these things aren't distributed equally. Bigger budget films tend to have much higher carbon footprints. And like basically as you move into scripted drama is less than features, though not less than features collectively because we do multiple episodes in television. And then comedy and unscripted tend to have our lowest carbon footprint asks. In terms of where that's breaking down, uh, where we're seeing a lot of this actual carbon ask, it's happening primarily in fuel, right? It's the fuel we're using to run vehicles. It's the fuel we're using to run generators. It's the fuel that we're using to move people various places in terms of production. And then after the fuel, it's happening in our materials usage. So food, plastics, and textiles are also really big spaces where when we write a script, depending on what we're asking for, we're incurring potentially large carbon asks. So with that in mind, there are some things that are sort of good news, like film production companies and broadcasters are totally working to become more sustainable. So as much as it can be, tempting to catastrophize, we are progressing. There are things like electric vehicles that we're looking at. We're looking at LED lights, upcycling production materials. All of those things are really useful in terms of sustainability. And as we write, it's worth thinking about where can we find space for those things? Because if we're putting those directly into the script, often that just becomes the world, and we create less of a sort of a hill for our potential sustainability coordinators or our sustainability allies in departments to climb. I keep hitting that space bar. So clearly, one of the first things we should be doing as writers is thinking about how do we find sustainable producers? Because it's much easier to be working with people who may know more about you in terms of how to do this cost effectively in production, and who may have their own practices to contribute. We don't have certification systems in Canada yet, though Rolling Green does exist in Quebec, and both Telefilm and Creative BC are building systems. Like Telefilm is now insisting upon sustainability plans and sustainability reports for things that it funds, which is excellent. You can also do research, like you can look at companies and what they are saying about how they are approaching sustainability. And networking at events like SPF, which, yay, you're all here ahead of oh, sorry. Slim, okay, yeah. You're already here and you're doing the networking. This is how we find ourselves allies and find ourselves networks and figure out who we're going to want to work with. Uh, Anytime you hear someone say that AI is going to solve this, right? Like we're not going to have to think about how we mitigate for our scripts. It's worth thinking about the fact that AI is not going to save us. Technology is unlikely, in fact, to save us on this, because at least current estimates coming from MIT look like the carbon cost of creating audiovisual material within like language, essentially what are language modules or these sort of associative AI, may end up being 5 to 10 times the carbon footprint of regular production, because it takes there's so many computations, there's so much storage to think about. So costs for AI generation may come down, and there are absolutely folks who are studying this, but oh, excellent. Thank you. We've got some resources coming up in the chat, and definitely provide those if you have them. There are going to be people here who know more than me. But definitely when we bring down carbon costs with things like AI, it often leads to overuse, right? Like fuel efficient cars have actually led to more emissions because we sort of use them freely. So it's worth thinking about that pattern. Text AI, sadly for those of us who are screenwriters, is less carbon intensive than the audiovisual, but it's still not ideal. So if you're thinking about AI and thinking about how that relates to production, uh, know what model you're in, know what the the carbon cost is. And that's going to continue to, like, I'm not going to pretend to be an absolute expert, but it's going to be an ongoing thing as we deal with AI. In terms of what can writers do, our biggest decisions are, what are we pitching and who are we pitching it to? So thinking about finding sustainable producers, but also thinking about how can we shape pitches that are going to help us mitigate the carbon costs of our work, right? Because this is essentially how we're going to bridge the gap between this moment now where we're an industry that puts a lot of carbon into the world, and an industry that can be sustainable. And so in addition to thinking about what we're pitching, we can also think about production concerns, like as we're going through our scripts. So thinking about, like, how much are we moving people, right? How many shooting days are we proposing are going to happen on location? How many different locations are there? How many times do we have to, like, run trucks, run generators, etc.? How many people are we insisting on moving out to that location, right? When we move large bodies of people, we're creating a much larger carbon ask, right? So how many people are we sending out there, bringing back, feeding, heating, etc.? Are there ways that we can minimize set builds, right? Like I'm sure anybody who's been in production has seen the colossal waste that happens when we discard whole set builds. So can we minimize builds? Can we find ways to reuse builds? Can we find ways to reuse locations and be efficient in that way in terms of generating a script that's going to have a smaller carbon ask? Can we find sustainable locations, right? Can we find locations where if we need energy, we don't need generators, or we can tap into the electrical grid, or we can, tap into sort of the energy supply of a building that's like an LED building. That's way better than running generators on gas. And this is also a place where I think it's great, like as early as possible, it's good to advocate with consulting with departments, because there are definitely people in departments, there'll be people in costumes, there'll be people in sets who are looking for the ways that they can mitigate the carbon asks of their own work. And if we speak again across our borders there, maybe even before we're going into production, if we're just meeting people at SPF, we can be learning how they are trying to mitigate, and we can think about ways we can support them in their scripts. Because one of the things that absolutely has stuck with me from actually developing this workshop last year was Mel had a great story about going onto a show where they were just using plastic water bottles in their scenes, and talking to the line producer and being like, why can't these be swapped out? Why can't these be reusable? Why can't these
Jury
be?
duty.
Oh, I was not gonna name names. I was not gonna draw.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's all right. You're fine to do it. It's your
Jury
story.
duty, I called you out. No, but they're literally in a boardroom. Hi, why? It's not hard to have pitchers and glasses, actually, literally. To me, that just makes even so much more sense, so that they're not actually purchasing water bottles. Anyway.
But the point being that the line producer didn't feel like she could push back on that. Whereas if it had been baked into the script for her, there would be no need for her to engage in that kind of lopsided friction that happens on set sometimes to negotiate things, right? Like we can make it the world rather than something that they have to expend their capital fighting for, which leaves them capital to fight for other things. So thinking about how we do that for our colleagues is absolutely part of how we are mitigating for the climate in our script. And so, like, for me, in addition to the writing part, sometimes I script coordinate and because or story coordinate. And so that means that often I'm building these lists, right? I'm building these like here, like I did not build this set list. This is one I just stole from the internet. But every one of these sets is a carbon ask, right? So thinking about like looking through, and like especially if you're somebody who has to deal with these kinds of lists all the time, looking through and asking yourself, do we really need all of these, right? Are there spaces that like, could we move something that's going to happen, you know, at the high school onto the forest space, or could we move the forest space onto the high school so that again we've minimized how we're going to like how many people we're going to have to move, how many places we're going to have to be, how many generators we have to run. uh like if you're in final draft, this is one of again those things where like if you're not a production person, you can use the production tools to make yourself lists of these and actually just check for yourself, how many locations did I set up, how many characters am I moving to places, right? That's kind of what I think that's the next slide. You can also think about just like building more sustainability into what people are going to have to find for you. So like, can your vehicles be electric? Can they be hybrid? Can you reuse them, right? Like, is there a way that if this is a car that's happening in one space, does everybody in this universe have to have like a different car? Can there be people who are carless and then we only have to have like the one car that they're all going to ride around in? Sometimes we can't get away with that narratively, but it's worth thinking about because like every car is a big carbon ask. So if we can reduce, that's excellent. Absolutely reducing depictions of single-use plastics. Not only does that help make the whole world more environmentally friendly, but it reduces our waste and really selfishly, having seen the microplastics movie at SPF, reduces our exposure to the things that are gonna give us tumors in our brains. So just thinking about that kind of space. Thinking about, again, textiles are a huge carbon ask for scripts. So like how many costumes and props can we source responsibly? Can we think about like making our cool fashion characters people who thrift rather than people who have to just like go somewhere and buy the absolute newest thing? Can we think about ways in which we can make costumes things that are like replicable? Like as much as I am not a fan of the royal family, I always think about like Kate Middleton reusing her wardrobe and how that is part of the new vision of even what upper class people look like the stealth wealth, the responsibility. And again, thinking about how are you like, are you talking to your showrunner? Are you finding people to work for who want to do this work? Because I feel like a lot of people do want to do this work. Are we thinking about whether or not there's a sustainability coordinator that you can talk with? Are there other people you can network with to like find more information, to think about? Because as much as like this is sort of a surface level, there's going to be all kinds of other ways that we're going to continue to evolve. So it's this idea of like staying current, understanding where your carbon asks are, and thinking about how to reduce them. And I think, yeah, that slide was out of order. So again, like looking at the cast list and thinking every person on a cast list is a carbon ask. So do we absolutely need like Officer Callahan in this particular script, or can we pare away to the essential? And so yes, this may absolutely, if some of you are sitting here feeling like, oh, I don't want this bar on my creativity, I want my creativity to sort of run endlessly, that's completely fair. Like I will sometimes feel that too. But I think it's worth thinking about the idea that we are almost always in anything we create working with constraints. And if someone told you this was a constraint because of the budget, because of what could be made, we would just, yeah, we would take the note, we would make the change. We do it all the time. And so like the person asking us now to make the change, to like find the felicities for the budget, is it's like it's the planet. It is literally our carbon budget for our survival. So thinking about that as like a constraint, a valuable constraint in terms of sometimes like sometimes bottle episodes are absolutely the best episodes of a series because they are engaged in creative economy. They require us to be creative in different ways. And so I think about this a lot as like the work of developing a sustainable imagination, right? Like, are there things that, like, for instance, in playwriting, there's lots of spectacles we just can't put on stage. So we end up creating them in language. And sometimes the space of the imagination is so much more interesting than anything we could try to, sort of special effect or CGI up. And it's also, again, worth thinking about the idea that we are building stories for the worlds that we want. Like, I love sci-fi, I love big tentpole movies, but I do feel like what I want more than a big tentpole movie that was filmed in 15 different locations is I want to be able to like go to the beach with my son and have the beach not be choked to death with smoke from forest fires. That's more important to me. So I'm going to find the story that gets me that shows me the pleasures of a world where, like, yeah, maybe I don't get to watch Deadpool, but where I am going to get to have that vacation. I'll do a quick wrap up. So basically, again, thinking about applying a climate lens to our work, there's opportunities to think about where the planet exists in premises, in characters, and it can add this sort of sense of depth and irony and this sense of like the world as we are actually experiencing it rather than sort of a false reality. And it's definitely worth to think about how we're modeling sustainable behaviors and where our biases come from. Like, one of the things we talked about in one of the earlier groups that I thought was great was this sense of like, is this propaganda? But at the same time, almost everything that we make is propaganda for something, right? Like it's propaganda for the cruise ships or propaganda for the cars. So the planet can use better representation, I think is what Mel says all the time. And it's worth thinking that if this didn't feel easy or organic, it's because we don't have a lot of practice, right? Like, we have been alienated from this kind of storytelling and these kind of stories for a long time. So think of it as a muscle that you can exercise. Like, pay attention to where climate shows up or does not show up in spaces, right? Like, are we thinking about biodiversity? Are we thinking about intersectional costs? And like, just practice the work of doing a climate pass. Practice the work of saying, hey, do I need all these extra carbon asks in the script? The really good news is that tends to make your scripts more filmable and budget friendly, and producers tend to like that anyway. So it's a valuable skill on multiple levels. And with that said, a few resources that are excellent. The Good Energy Playbook is out there. It's got lots of examples of these both real examples of climate in work and also like pitches for episodes of the Golden Girls from like established writers. Like, this is what a Golden Girls climate episode would look like. Making and Being is a terrific
Sorry.
all resource for like actually thinking about what the carbon and human costs of an activity are. It's like sort of a larger academic piece. Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement is a lovely text to read to think about how we have been alienated from thinking about the climate. I will also definitely recommend Jennifer Odell's How to Do Nothing, which is about both the climate and the attention economy, like how we find ourselves climate existence within a space where we have constant demands on our like our attention and our productivity. There's this sort of impetus to do more all the time. And finally, the Indigenous Screen Office's collaboration guide, Protocols and Pathways, is a lovely sort of space to start thinking about how it is we do this in right relations with Indigenous communities. All right, with that said, thank you very much. Please sign up for the SPF's excellent newsletter. And it was so lovely to get to spend time with you today.
I just want to say a big thanks to Jordan and to everybody for being here. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And, we look forward to hearing from you. Send us feedback and stay in touch.